We want to look this morning in John chapter 4 at a time when some change was coming. We know the story. Jesus had stopped by Jacob's well. Jacob had dug a well over in what was then Samaria. Jesus stopped by and met a Samaritan woman sitting on Jacob's well. He was sitting on Jacob's well. And see, up until then, the Jews had no dealings with the Samaritans. The Samaritans were part Jew, but they had mingled. And the Jew looked on the Samaritans as worse than dogs. They had nothing to do with them whatsoever all those years. The Samaritans worshipped the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they had thrown in a lot of the things that, had came in with the people that they had intermingled with. And so the Jews had nothing to do with them. But Jesus was sitting on Jacob's well, on the edge of Jacob's well, and a Samaritan woman showed up. The Bible said he had needs, but he must needs go through Samaria. Jesus went by that way because there was a purpose he was about to fulfill.
Come on, sir.
Things were about to change. And we'll start reading at the 19th verse. The woman said unto him, and he'd been talking to the woman of Samaria, and he had told her that if she'd have knew the gift of God, she'd have asked him for some water. He asked her for some water. And the woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that thou art a prophet. Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship. And Jesus said unto her, Woman, believe me, the hour cometh when you shall neither in this mountain nor yet at Jerusalem worship the Father. You worship you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. But the hour cometh, and now is, when the true worshippers shall worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father seeketh such to worship him. God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. And the woman said unto him, I know the Messiah is coming, who is called Christ. When he is come, he will tell us all things. And Jesus said unto her, I that speak unto thee am he. Jesus had came, folks, with a new truth. She had understood about Messiah coming, but she hadn't understood about the message of Messiah. Now, I want you to notice that Jesus didn't say that it had been wrong for the Jews to worship at Jerusalem. He didn't say that that was the wrong thing to do. He just said the hour has come now, where it's not the place that you're in, but the condition of the Spirit. See, they went up to Jerusalem to commune with God, but Jesus said things are changing. God is seeking those that will worship him in spirit and in truth wherever they are. Amen. He had brought to her the message of salvation, folks. It has to be the Spirit. God has sent a gift to man, Jesus, salvation to all men, wherever you are. He's telling this woman, hey, they worshipped in Jerusalem, but they worshipped in this mountain. But the time is now that wherever you are, you can worship God in the Spirit and the truth, because that's what God is looking for. He's not looking for the place you're at physically, but the place you're at spiritually. There was a change coming. See, because the Samaritans could go up to that mountain and worship, and the Jews could go over to Jerusalem and worship, and just be in a religious habit. They went up there. The Pharisees went up to Jerusalem to worship. It was a religious habit. Jesus said there's a new thing coming, a new day dawning. God's looking for some folks that will worship Him because they desire to. Not because the law said to. See, I think what happened so much to the church is that we got into religious habits.
Come on, sir. Come on.
We did what everybody had done behind us. We thought everything had to be a certain way. And so we just got into a religious habit. And we forgot that God was looking for some people to be different, not some more people to do the same.
Come on, sir.
He was looking for some people who would take what He said and just walk in that.
Yes, He is.
Things have changed. Things have changed. The Samaritans was about to receive some salvation on their own. Jesus went over into Samaria, stayed with them for 2 days, the only time that I can find in the Scripture where He hung out with the Gentiles. 2 days. And gathered disciples, those that believed on Him. They came to believe on Him. A new thing was happening, folks. A Jewish Messiah had went over to the Gentiles and told them about salvation. Never had happened before.
Hallelujah.
Never had that chance before, but things was changing.
Hallelujah.
The disciples, they'd been over to the grocery store to get some groceries. They'd been down at Walmart. And they got back and Jesus started telling them that He had meat that they didn't know of.
Come on.
He said His meat was to do the will of the Father, to finish the work. Folks, that ought to be our only desire, is to finish what God has called us to do. It shouldn't make any difference what the neighbors think about us. It shouldn't make any difference what the religious people think about us. The only thing in our life that we should be focused on today is what will God have me do in these last days to make a difference in the kingdom. Do you understand that God has called us all in these last days to make a difference in the kingdom? The benches weren't cold when we sit on them. He didn't call us to be a bench warmer. He called us to be somebody to bring people into the fold. Yes. See, we come here to get together to draw strength for next week. Amen. Folks, this is not an end within itself, coming to the Bible barn. Out there is the battle, and out there is people who've never heard, and out there is those folks that we need to be talking to about what's coming upon the world. Here's where we need to draw our strength. See, and the change that God is bringing us to, some folks will not accept. But we cannot worry about that. We must be willing. We must be willing to move forward with God when God says it's time to move forward from where we're at spiritually today. And I've used this analogy several times, but it's simple and easy to understand. They was talking about Nate's great-grandson. They feed him milk, and he will grow on milk. He will start gaining weight. He will start gaining length. He'll start gaining strength on milk. But there will come a time, folks, when milk will stop doing what it's doing now, and if we don't give him something else, he'll start going in a different direction. The same thing that is bringing him health today will one day cause him to be anemic if that's all he gets. Same way in our spiritual life. The things that made us yesterday, made us grow, that started us on the journey, won't carry us all the way. Salvation will carry you all the way. Don't get me wrong there. But what you were doing when you were a newborn Christian, God expects us to grow. Amen. He doesn't expect us to always sit around drinking the spiritual milk. Because if we do, we grow anemic. And we die. That's just the way it is. We are a river in the Lord, not a stagnant lake. We have to move with the Spirit of God. And there's a change sweeping through the church, folks. There's a change. The woman at the well felt it, and people in the city of Samaria felt it. But too many people dry out on God simply because they will move no further than what they've always heard. You know, we get stuck in denominational doctrine. You begin to talk to people about Jesus, and they begin to tell you what they believe and what their denomination teaches. Might have been good yesterday, but we're not in yesterday. We have to drop those walls, tear down those walls that will keep us from moving into God's greater revelation and God's greater grace that will take us into these last days. See, folks, Jesus started out in his ministry. John came teaching repentance. That's what John taught. Jesus started out in his ministry teaching repentance. His very first message was repent. But he didn't stop there. He began to tell them about what God had for them. He began to tell them about a Spirit God was going to send that would lead them into all truth. He began to tell them that what God expected of them to do. He began to grow the disciples into something greater. They started at repentance, but that was not where they were supposed to stay. They were supposed to move ahead. We can't be satisfied, folks, with yesterday's blessing. Because this thing is a moving thing. You see, Christ's own disciples almost missed their calling. Because they got comfortable following him. They thought they were called just to follow after him while he was here. When he was crucified, they scattered one everywhere. That wasn't what he called them for. He taught them 3.5 years to carry the message to the world. But see, Christ had been their safety umbrella for those years. And suddenly when the umbrella closed, they had lost the purpose of their calling. They didn't understand that as an individual, they had a purpose and a call. They were just following Jesus. You know, after the crucifixion, they were hiding everywhere. He didn't call them to hide. He called them to carry on the message that he'd been teaching them all that time. Almost missed it when the change happened. Almost missed it. And a lot of, not the apostles all came back to him except Judas, but a lot of the disciples that had followed him all that time did miss it. Thousands came out to hear him, and the Bible said they believed on him. But in the upper room where he told them to go, there wasn't but 120 that showed up. A lot of them did miss the change. He's not here anymore, so we're not going over to the upper room. See, we're coming to the place, folks, that the truth God has taught us will have to be the faith that sustains us. We're coming to the place where we're really going to have to live by faith. Yes. The just shall live by faith. How many knows that the faith that he put in us, it's not just so that we can, the faith that's in us is not just so that we can be happy within ourselves. I'm a Christian. No, that faith that he put in us is so that we can grow into the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. The time is coming, folks, when that faith that is in us, we talked, I believe it was last week when we talked about Jesus feeding the multitude with little. He blessed it, he broke it, and he handed it out, and he kept multiplying it in his hand. The time is coming, folks, when the faith that is in us may be called upon to do some breaking and blessing and handing out. You been watching the news?
Yes, sir.
Things are changing.
Yes, they are.
So the church must move up. The church must move up. We know, folks, while we're waiting on God's direction, we need to be doing and growing, not just waiting. Waiting on God's call to step up. Waiting on God's call to say, this is what I want you to do today. See, because God's timing is everything.
Yes, it is.
Do you know the prodigal son? You remember the story of the prodigal son?
Yes.
The inheritance that his father gave him was his already. He was going to inherit that. But he ran ahead of his inheritance, didn't he?
Yes.
He said, I want it now. He wasn't ready for it now. And the Bible said he found himself over there feeding pigs. Folks, if we run ahead of God, we'll find ourselves partying with the pigs. But if we stay too far behind God, we'll lose His voice.
Amen.
And we'll just be walking in place somewhere out of touch.
Amen.
See, God didn't call us. He didn't call us to stay in a single place. He called us to move when He said move, and to do what He said do. Jesus was, what, 30 years old when His ministry began? He didn't just wait 30 years. For 30 years, He was growing in the grace and in the truth of who He was. He was moving for all of it. But the time came that His ministry was ready to begin, and He was ready to begin His ministry. We have to wait on God, but not just say, I'm not going to do anything until He moves, until He exalts me. Do what you know to do today.
Amen.
But be attentive to the Spirit of God for tomorrow. See, the great apostle Paul was called on the road to Damascus. He was. Hey, there's no doubt about it. Paul had been out, killing the Christians, hauling them off to jail. But on his way to Damascus, things changed in Paul's life. And I want you to understand that the change in Paul's life didn't make him more comfortable. Did it? So often, if we're not careful, we're looking for the absolute comfort of the flesh. If it's not the absolute comfort of the flesh, we think it ain't God calling. Because we heard so much about man's prosperity. God wants you to prosper, but true prosperity is walking in His blessings.
Amen.
Paul was doing pretty good. He was doing pretty good. He had been taught under the greatest teachers of that time. He was a Pharisee. He knew the law. He knew the prophets. He was well spoken. He'd been exalted in the Jews' religion. On the way to Damascus, he was called into something higher and something greater. Now here Paul is with all these great credentials. In today's way of thinking, somebody with that much credentials, if God had called him to be an apostle, he would have got up, preached all the way to Jerusalem, and demanded the overseer's job. What happens to a lot of preachers? They're called all right, but they start preaching where they don't have a clue where God's trying to take them.